There are very few names in the history of Hollywood that need no introduction at all. John Wayne is one of them. To an entire generation, and the generations after that, he wasn't just an actor, he was the Duke, a towering figure in a cowboy hat, riding across the screen with swagger that felt bigger than life itself. He became the face of the American West before most people had ever set foot anywhere near it. Children who had never seen a desert in their lives grew up believing they understood what it meant to be a cowboy, simply because they had watched John Wayne walk across one on a movie screen. But here's a question almost nobody stops to ask. Was John Wayne only a cowboy on camera? Or did the man behind the legend actually live the life he portrayed, somewhere far away from the cameras and the studio lights, somewhere the tabloids rarely bother to look? The answer is yes. And the place where that answer comes fully alive is a state most people associate only with desert heat, cactus-lined highways, and red rock canyons, Arizona. Today, we're going to dig into a story that surprisingly few people know in full detail, a story that Hollywood history books tend to gloss over in a sentence or two. It's the story of how one of Hollywood's biggest stars fell so deeply in love with a place that he bought ranches there, raised cattle there, raised his own children there, became genuine friends with farmers and shopkeepers in tiny, dusty towns most people had never heard of, and left behind a legacy so strong that decades after his death, an entire stretch of highway still carries his name. This is the real Arizona story of John Wayne, not the polished movie version, not the studio press release version, but the one that actually happened, pieced together from ranch records, local memory, and the landscape itself. And to understand how deep this love affair really went, we need to go all the way back to where it all began, long before he was ever called a legend, long before the Duke was a name that meant anything to anyone at all. The year was 1930. John Wayne was still, for all practical purposes, a nobody. He wasn't the icon the world would come to know decades later. He was a young, largely unproven actor cast in one of his very first major roles, a film called The Big Trail. The production took him to the area around Yuma, Arizona, for location shooting, and would end up being far more significant to his life than anyone on that set could have possibly predicted at the time. Picture the scene. A young man, barely into his 20s, stepping off a dusty transport truck into a landscape that felt almost otherworldly compared to the studio backlots of Los Angeles. No painted backdrops here. No carefully constructed sets designed to look like the frontier. Just miles and miles of real desert, stretching out in every direction, framed by distant mountains that seemed to change color with every passing hour of daylight. This was not an easy period for Wayne professionally. The Big Trail itself underperformed at the box office, a disappointment that could easily have ended a young actor's career before it truly began. Wayne spent much of the following decade working through smaller films, minor roles, forgettable westerns churned out quickly and cheaply, slowly building his craft and earning the kind of recognition that would eventually make him a household name. It was a period defined far more by struggle than by glamour, by long days and short paychecks, by the constant uncertainty of not knowing whether the next role would come at all. But something happened during that first stretch of time in Arizona that had nothing whatsoever to do with box office numbers or studio politics. Wayne encountered a landscape unlike anything he had experienced before. Wide open desert stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. Dramatic rock formations carved slowly over centuries by wind and time and the patient erosion of countless desert storms. Skies that turned brilliant shades of orange and crimson and deep violet as the sun dropped behind the mountains each evening, painting the entire landscape in colors that no studio lighting rig could ever hope to replicate. For a young actor coming from a very different world, this place had a kind of raw, unfiltered authenticity that stuck with him in a way few things in his early career did. There was something almost inevitable about the pairing of Arizona and the Western genre, as though the two had been designed for each other from the very beginning. The state offered exactly what filmmakers of Westerns were chasing: real cowboy culture that hadn't yet faded entirely into nostalgia and legend, real working ranches with real cattle and real cowhands, real dust kicked up by real horses moving across real open range, and a lingering sense that the old West wasn't entirely gone, just a little quieter than it used to be, waiting patiently in the desert for someone to come find it again. For a genre built almost entirely on the promise of authenticity, Arizona wasn't just convenient scenery chosen for budget reasons. It was a genuine article, unpolished and real in a way that mattered. And for Wayne personally, this wasn't simply a location he happened to work in for a few weeks before moving on to the next assignment. Looking back at how the rest of his life unfolded, it becomes clear that this first trip to Arizona planted a seed that would take years to fully grow. It was the opening chapter of a relationship with a place that would only deepen with time. Long after the big trail had come and gone from theaters, long after the studio executives who greenlit that early, underperforming film had moved on entirely to other projects and, in some cases, other careers. There is something almost poetic about the idea that Wayne's entire Arizona story began with commercial failure. Had the big trail been a runaway success, perhaps Wayne's career would have taken an entirely different path, one that kept him tethered more tightly to the studio system and further away from the open range that would come to mean so much to him. Instead, the relative quiet that followed the film's disappointing performance gave him room to keep returning to places like Arizona, to keep building relationships that had nothing to do with box office receipts. But this was only the beginning. The real story, the one that would cement Wayne's connection to Arizona for the rest of his life, was still years away, waiting patiently for the right film, the right moment, and the right landscape to bring it fully into focus. Fast forward to 1939, a year that changed absolutely everything for John Wayne. This was the year Stagecoach was released, and almost overnight, Wayne went from a working actor grinding through low-budget productions to a genuine, bona fide Hollywood star. It's hard to overstate how significant this single film was, not just for Wayne's career, but for the entire Western genre as a cinematic form. And once again, Arizona and its surrounding landscapes played a central role in the story, with much of the film's now iconic imagery drawing directly on the dramatic terrain the region offered. Stagecoach didn't just launch Wayne into stardom overnight. It redefined what a Western film could look like and feel like, setting a visual standard that countless films would try and mostly fail to replicate for decades afterward. The wide, sweeping shots of open desert, the towering rock formations rising up against impossibly blue skies, the tiny figures of riders and stagecoaches dwarfed by the sheer scale of the landscape around them, all of it became inseparable from the Western genre itself. And that terrain, that unmistakable sense of scale and grandeur, was a huge part of why those shots worked so powerfully on audiences who had never seen anything quite like it before. Nearly a decade later, in 1948, Wayne starred in Red River, a film shot in the small town of Elgin in southern Arizona, a place so small that most maps barely bothered to mark it. The film went on to earn 2 Academy Award nominations and remains regarded to this day as one of the finest westerns ever produced. It's the kind of film still studied by directors and screenwriters for how it built tension, how it handled its landscape, and how it used a physical environment almost as a character in its own right. Between Stagecoach and Red River, Wayne also starred in Angel and the Bad Man in 1947, another film that added meaningfully to his growing reputation as a definitive face of the American Western on screen. Taken together, these films tell a clear and consistent story. Wayne didn't just happen to make 1 or 2 movies in Arizona by chance. He returned to the state again and again, appearing in dozens of films either shot in or connected to Arizona locations over the course of his long career. This pattern wasn't coincidental. It wasn't simply the result of studio scheduling decisions made far above his pay grade. It reflected a genuine, deeply personal preference. Wayne chose Arizona, repeatedly and consistently, because something about the place resonated with him on a level that went far beyond professional convenience or contractual obligation. And perhaps the most telling detail of all is what happened after the cameras stopped rolling and the crew began packing up equipment for the long drive back to Los Angeles. Rather than heading straight back to the more polished, glamorous world of Hollywood parties and studio events once filming wrapped, Wayne would often stay behind in Arizona for extended stretches of time. He spent time out on the open range, immersed himself fully in ranch life, worked with cattle, rode horses across open country, not as a publicity stunt orchestrated by a studio press agent, but as something that seemed to genuinely, deeply fulfill him in a way his career alone could not. He lived, at least part of the time, exactly the way his characters did on screen, without an audience watching, without a director calling out instructions. This is really where John Wayne starts to separate himself from so many other Hollywood stars of his era, most of whom were content to leave their on-screen personas entirely behind the moment filming wrapped. For most actors, the cowboy persona ended the instant the director called cut and the wardrobe department collected the costumes. For Wayne, it didn't end there at all. He wanted to actually live that life, not simply perform it for a paycheck. And that desire, growing steadily over the course of the 1940s and into the 1950s, eventually led him to make one of the most significant decisions of his personal life, purchasing a sprawling 50,000-acre cattle ranch in the heart of Arizona's high country, a place that would become far more than just a financial investment or a tax write-off suggested by an accountant. It would become his second home, his genuine sanctuary away from the noise of Hollywood, and in many ways, the truest and most honest expression of who he really was underneath the fame. That story, the story of the 26 Bar Ranch, is where things get truly fascinating and where we start to see a side of John Wayne that most of his fans, even his most devoted ones, never fully got to know. If there's one place that came to symbolize John Wayne's true, unfiltered relationship with Arizona, it's the 26 Bar Ranch. Located near the small town of Eager, tucked into the White Mountains region of eastern Arizona, this was no small operation dabbled in for fun. It spanned an astonishing 50,000 acres, a scale that made it one of the more significant ranching operations in the entire state at the time, rivaling operations run by families who have been ranching that land for generations. Wayne purchased a ranch from the Mars family. Yes, the very same Mars family behind the famous candy company that put chocolate bars in nearly every household in America. Before Wayne took ownership, the property had actually been called the Milky Way 26 Bar Ranch, a name that tied directly back to the family's confectionery business empire. But that name didn't last long once word got around about its new, far more famous owner. Almost immediately, locals and visitors alike started referring to it simply as the John Wayne Ranch, and despite the property technically retaining its original name on paper for years, the nickname stuck for good, eventually becoming a name everyone used without a second thought. At the 26 Bar Ranch, Wayne raised Hereford cattle, a premium breed known for producing high-quality beef and prized throughout the ranching industry. This wasn't a hobby he dabbled in occasionally for the sake of good publicity photos. It was a serious agricultural operation that he invested real time, real money, and real personal attention into, treating it with the same level of seriousness and professionalism he brought to negotiating film contracts back in Los Angeles. He studied breeding lines. He paid attention to market conditions. He hired experienced ranch managers and, by most accounts, actually listened to their advice rather than simply throwing his celebrity weight around. And it's here that one of the most remarkable and least talked about stories connected to Wayne's Arizona life takes place. At some point, a young woman visited the ranch carrying a set of new ideas about how livestock could be handled with far less stress and far less cruelty than traditional methods allowed. Her name was Temple Grandin. At the time, she wasn't yet the internationally recognized figure she would later become. She was simply someone with a groundbreaking concept in her mind, a curved cattle chute designed around the natural behavior patterns and instinct of livestock, meant to make handling calmer, quieter, and far less dramatic for the animals moving through it. As it happened, Wayne himself was present at the ranch on the very day Grandin presented her ideas to the operations management. He was impressed enough by what he heard, the logic behind it, the careful observation of animal behavior that had clearly gone into the design, that he gave her the opportunity to actually install her curved cattle chute design right there on his own property. It was, in the moment, a relatively small decision, the kind of thing that might not have even made it into a single sentence of a press release. But it had consequences that rippled far, far beyond the boundaries of the 26 Bar Ranch. Grandin's design, first tested and refined in a real, working ranch environment like Wayne's operation, was later adopted widely across the livestock industry as a whole, changing how animals were handled on ranches and in processing facilities across the country. Today, Temple Grandin is known globally as a pioneering expert in animal behavior and humane livestock handling, and she is equally, perhaps even more widely, renowned for her advocacy and personal insight into autism, having become one of the most recognizable voices on the subject anywhere in the world. It's a genuinely striking thought that one of Hollywood's most iconic tough guy actors, a man known for playing hardened gunfighters and stoic soldiers, played a small but entirely real part in helping launch the career of someone who would go on to change an entire industry and, in her own way, change how the world thinks about neurodiversity as well. But the 26-bar ranch wasn't only about business achievements or fortunate historical footnotes involving future scientific pioneers. It was also, perhaps most importantly, where Wayne's own family built lasting memories that had nothing to do with movie premieres or magazine covers. His children learned real ranch work there, how to handle horses properly and safely, how to work cattle across open, unpredictable terrain, how to live according to a rhythm dictated by sunrise and weather rather than studio schedules and shooting call sheets. For his kids, this wasn't Hollywood at all. It was hard, honest, hands-on work under a punishing Arizona sun, and it gave them a grounding that few children of major movie stars ever get the chance to experience firsthand. Whenever Wayne's children were at the ranch, they weren't treated as a pampered offspring of a famous actor, shielded from anything difficult or dirty. They were expected to work, to learn from ranch hands who had spent their entire lives in the saddle, and to earn their place just like anyone else on a genuine working cattle operation. That, in many ways, tells you everything you really need to know about how seriously Wayne took this part of his life. It wasn't performance, and it wasn't for show. It was real, day in and day out, whether cameras were anywhere nearby or not. The 26-bar ranch was far from the only piece of Arizona that John Wayne came to call his own. Toward the end of the 1950s, Wayne made another major move, purchasing more than 4,000 acres of farmland situated between the small towns of Maricopa and Stanfield, not far from Phoenix, in a stretch of desert farmland that most outsiders would have driven straight past without a second glance. There's an interesting, somewhat humbling twist to how this particular purchase came about, one that reveals a more human, less glamorous side of Wayne's business dealings. His tax attorney had advised him that the land would make for a sound financial investment, and on that advice alone, Wayne moved forward with a cotton farming operation on the property. The problem was that neither Wayne himself nor the company he initially hired to manage the farming actually had much real, practical expertise in cotton cultivation, a crop that demands precise knowledge of soil, irrigation timing, and pest management that can't simply be improvised. The operation struggled month after month, season after season. Here was one of the biggest movie stars in the entire world, a man who could command enormous sums for a single film role, quietly deal with the frustration and embarrassment of a farming venture that simply wasn't working out the way it was supposed on paper. It's the kind of detail that rarely makes it into glossy biographies, but it says something important about who Wayne really was. A man willing to try, willing to fail, and willing to figure out what needed to change. Then came the turning point in this particular story. Wayne started paying closer attention to his neighboring property, owned by a man named Lewis Johnson, and noticed, season after season, that Johnson's farm was consistently, undeniably outperforming his own by a wide margin, rather than letting pride or ego get in the way, which would have been easy enough for a man of his fame and stature. Wayne asked around and eventually put a simple, direct question to his own brokerage contacts. Who, in this entire stretch of farmland, actually knew how to farm cotton properly? The answer came back almost immediately, without hesitation, Lewis Johnson. That single question, asked with genuine humility rather than defensiveness, marked the beginning of a partnership and a genuine, lasting friendship that would go on to define what eventually became known as the Red River Ranch. It's a small but genuinely telling detail about Wayne's character. Rather than doubling down on a failing venture purely out of stubbornness or wounded pride, he recognized real expertise when he saw it clearly demonstrated right next door, and he built a meaningful relationship around that recognition instead of resenting it. But what makes this entire chapter of Wayne's Arizona story so compelling isn't really about cotton yields, irrigation schedules, or farming logistics at all. It's about the relationships he built, slowly and genuinely, with the ordinary people of Stanfield and Maricopa, two towns most people outside Arizona have never even heard of. Whenever Wayne visited the Red River Ranch, he would drive through the small downtown areas of these tiny communities and stop at local businesses along the way, not because a publicist told him it would look good, but simply because it was part of his routine. And remarkably, people didn't treat him like a celebrity to be mobbed or chased down for autographs. He had become, in every meaningful, practical sense, one of them. Wayne had a particular, well-documented fondness for the local children in these small towns. He would stand for hours at a time, patiently signing autographs, chatting with kids who probably couldn't fully grasp just how famous the man standing in front of them actually was, laughing along with them, asking about school and chores, and whatever else came up in conversation. And when he had time to simply relax, away from any obligation at all, Wayne would often head to his favorite local spot, the tabletop tavern in nearby Stanfield, where he would sit with local farmers late into the evening, trade stories about crops and weather and cattle prices, and simply be part of the community, rather than standing apart from it as some untouchable Hollywood figure. This part of the story reveals something quietly important about Wayne's relationship with Arizona as a whole. He wasn't just a celebrity who occasionally passed through for a photo opportunity or quick publicity appearance. He became embedded in these small communities in a way that very few people of his level of fame ever managed to achieve. Then or now, people didn't just recognize him on sight. They knew him genuinely as a neighbor and a friend. When Wayne passed away in 1979, Lewis Johnson made the decision to step away from the cattle business as well, closing a chapter that had begun years earlier with one honest question about who really knew how to farm. Wayne's children were preparing to sell off his share of the operation, and Johnson, reportedly, decided it made more practical sense to exit the business himself entirely rather than continue on with a new, unfamiliar partner he didn't know or trust in the same way. It was a quiet, practical, almost understated ending to a partnership that had started over a simple, humble question in a struggling cotton field decades earlier. These two properties, the 26-bar ranch and the Red River Ranch, represent two genuinely different sides of Wayne's deep connection to Arizona. One was about legacy, family, and even a small but entirely real contribution to scientific and industry-wide progress through Temple Grandin's groundbreaking work. The other was about humility, community, and genuine friendship built on mutual respect rather than fame or celebrity status. Together, they paint a much fuller, richer picture of a man whose relationship with this state went far deeper than simple location scouting or straightforward business investment. But Arizona held even more history connected to Wayne than these two remarkable ranches alone, including a property so historically significant, so layered with centuries of human history, that it's often described as the single most storied ranch in the entire state. Near the Arizona-Mexico border, tucked into a remote and beautifully quiet stretch of the Sonoran Desert, sits a place called Rancho de la USA. And John Wayne wasn't just an occasional visitor passing through here on a whim. He was a genuine regular, someone who kept coming back to this particular corner of the desert time and time again, year after year, long after he had every reason and every resource to simply stay away and enjoy easier comforts elsewhere. The history of this ranch stretches back far beyond Wayne's era, and understanding that deep, layered history helps explain why the connection meant so much to him. Rancho de la USA was once home to a village of the Tohono O'odham people, long before any European settlers ever arrived in the region. In the 1700s, the site became a mission outpost as part of New Spain, marking the beginning of centuries of transformation, conflict, and cultural exchange. Over time, the property passed through Spanish, Mexican, and eventually American hands, evolving with each new era of ownership, while somehow retaining a distinct, unmistakable sense of history that few other properties in the entire region could ever hope to match. By the time Hollywood discovered it, Rancho de la USA had already lived several entire lifetimes, weathered by centuries of change long, before a single film camera ever rolled anywhere near it. And once the film industry did discover its remote beauty, the guest list that followed became genuinely extraordinary. Tom Mix, widely regarded as Hollywood's very first true Western movie star, was a visitor here. So was Margaret Mitchell, the celebrated author of Gone with the Wind, seeking quiet away from the noise of her own literary fame. Western novelist Zane Grey spent time there as well, drawing inspiration from the same landscape that had once inspired countless real cowboys and ranchers. Film stars like Cesar Romero and Joan Crawford also passed through, drawn by the same remote charm. The ranch's significance wasn't limited only to entertainment figures, either, which makes its story even richer. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt visited during their time in public life. So did Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, decades later. In one particularly remarkable historical footnote, a government official named William Clayton reportedly drafted key portions of the Marshall Plan while staying in one of the ranch's small casitas back in 1948, a plan that would go on to shape the entire reconstruction of post-war Europe and, by extension, much of modern global history as we understand it today. Given all of this remarkable, layered history, it's easy to understand why Arizona's own tourism office has described Rancho de la Osa as the most historic ranch in the entire state, a title not handed out lightly. And within that sweeping, centuries-long story, John Wayne's presence wasn't just a passing footnote squeezed in alongside more famous names. It was a genuine continuation of exactly the kind of legacy the ranch had always attracted. Powerful, influential, larger-than-life figures who found something in that particular stretch of quiet desert that they simply couldn't find anywhere else, no matter how much money or fame they had access to. For Wayne, being a regular guest here wasn't about attaching a celebrity name to a prestigious address for the sake of appearances or headlines. It was about being part of something that had already existed long before Hollywood ever showed up on its doorstep, and that would clearly continue long after he himself was gone. He wasn't simply visiting history at Rancho de la Osa. In a very real, tangible sense, by returning again and again, he became part of that history himself. But Wayne's love for Arizona didn't end with his passing in 1979. In fact, some of the clearest, most visible evidence of just how mutual that love affair really was only became fully apparent after his death, woven permanently into the landscape, the roadways, and the institutions of the state itself for generations to come. What makes Wayne's relationship with Arizona so genuinely remarkable isn't just the sheer amount of time he spent there over the decades, or the number of sprawling properties he came to own across the state. It's the fact that Arizona loved him back, just as deeply and just as visibly, and that love is clearly outlasted him by nearly half a century now, showing no real signs of fading. Today, a significant stretch of Arizona's State Route 347 is officially, permanently known as John Wayne Parkway. Take a moment to actually think about what that means in practical terms. This isn't some small commemorative plaque tucked away in a museum lobby, easily overlooked by passers-by. It's an entire section of active public highway, used by thousands of ordinary people every single day for their daily commutes, their grocery runs, their trips to visit family, permanently named after a Hollywood actor who died decades ago. Very few entertainers in any era of American history ever received that kind of lasting, tangible, physically permanent recognition from an entire state government. Wayne's legacy in Arizona also lives on vividly through charitable work carried out in his name to this very day. The John Wayne Cancer Foundation continues to host regular events throughout the state, including golf tournaments that draw enthusiastic crowds, dinner and auction nights that raise substantial funds, and team roping competitions that celebrate the very ranching culture Wayne himself once lived and breathed. These events do far more than simply raise money for important cancer research and patient support. They bring entire communities together in exactly the spirit that Wayne himself seemed to genuinely value throughout his time in Arizona. People gathering, working together towards something meaningful, connected by more than just fame, celebrity, or nostalgia for old movies. Even after Wayne's death in 1979, his family's deep connection to Arizona didn't simply disappear overnight, fading quietly into the background of history. His sons, Michael and Ethan, eventually sold off portions of the family's remaining Arizona land holdings over the years that followed, as circumstances and priorities naturally changed with time. But a legacy attached to that land didn't simply vanish along with each individual sale. In fact, one of the more genuinely interesting modern developments involves the former Red River Ranch property itself, decades after Wayne first walked its fields. Portions of that same land are now being developed into a large, ambitious, master-planned residential community, complete with thousands of planned homes. And notably, quite tellingly, the developers behind this massive project have chosen to deliberately preserve the Red River Ranch name for the entire new development, explicitly citing a genuine desire to honor the property's rich history and its lasting connection to Wayne's personal legacy. It's a striking, almost poetic example of how deeply his presence became permanently woven into the identity of these particular places, so much so that decades later, real estate developers building something entirely new, entirely modern, still feel a genuine pull to acknowledge and preserve what came before them. All of this, the highway sign, the ongoing charitable foundation, the deliberately preserved name of a brand new real estate development, points to something considerably larger and more meaningful than simple nostalgia for a bygone movie star. It suggests that Wayne's connection to Arizona was never treated by the people of that state as just another passing celebrity real estate story, easily forgotten within a generation. It was treated consistently and deliberately as something genuinely worth remembering, worth honoring publicly, and worth carefully passing down to future generations who never had the chance to meet the man himself. So the real, lingering question becomes this: what was it about this particular place, this stretch of desert and mountain and small-town community, that created a bond this strong, one that has clearly, visibly outlasted the man himself by nearly half a century and shows no sign of fading anytime soon? When you step back and look at the full, complete picture of John Wayne's life in Arizona, spanning nearly 5 decades from that first uncertain trip to Yuma in 1930 all the way through his final years, one thing becomes genuinely unmistakable. Arizona was never simply a filming location for him, chosen for convenient scenery and cheap production costs. It was a genuine, authentic reflection of who he actually was underneath the fame, away from scripts, away from demanding directors, and away from restrictive studio contracts that dictated so much of his public life. On screen, Wayne built his entire towering career playing tough, honest, deeply grounded characters. Men who clearly belonged to the harsh, beautiful land they walked across. Men who understood hard work and quiet dignity better than almost anyone else in the room. In Arizona, that same character wasn't performance carefully crafted by a screenwriter at all. It was simply, plainly his real life, lived out in full view of neighbors who never once treated him differently for it. He raised cattle there, season after season, learning the difficult rhythms of ranching the hard way. He worked farmland there, even when that particular work didn't come easily or naturally to him at first. He sat with local farmers in small-town taverns late into the evening, treated as a genuine equal rather than a distant celebrity to be admired from afar. He taught his own children the real, tangible value of physical work on a working ranch, far removed from the comforts and conveniences that his enormous Hollywood success could easily have afforded them instead, had he chosen an easier path for his family. Hollywood gave John Wayne fame, considerable wealth, and a permanent, guaranteed place in the history of American cinema that will likely never fade. But Arizona appears to have given him something arguably even more valuable and far harder to buy, a genuine place where he could actually live the kind of life his most beloved characters represented on screen, rather than simply portraying that life for a few intense weeks of filming before returning to a very different, more artificial reality back in Los Angeles. That difference might explain why so many people who study Wayne's full life, beyond just his filmography, tend to arrive at the very same conclusion. He found fame and fortune in Hollywood, but in many real, meaningful ways, he left a genuine piece of his heart behind in Arizona and never fully asked for it back. Even now, more than 4 decades after his passing, that deep connection hasn't faded away with time the way so many celebrity legacies eventually do. It lives on vividly in the wide-open deserts he once rode across, in the ranches that still carry his name or hold on to his memory in quiet, meaningful ways, in the small towns where older residents still tell stories, passed down now to grandchildren, about the time the Duke walked through their dusty streets like he genuinely belonged there. Because in every single way that actually mattered, he did. So the next time you happen to watch a John Wayne film, perhaps late one evening on television, it might be worth remembering something beyond just the performance itself, beyond the familiar swagger and the recognizable voice. This wasn't simply an actor who happened to play cowboys convincingly for a paycheck. This was a man who, in his real everyday life, chose to walk the same difficult path his characters walked on screen, and found, in the wide deserts and quiet ranchlands of Arizona, a genuine home that fit him better, more comfortably, than any soundstage in Hollywood ever could. Have you ever visited Arizona yourself? Or is there a particular John Wayne film that has always stuck with you over years? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. I would genuinely love to hear them, and I read every single one. If you enjoyed this video, please consider taking a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss future stories exploring the real, lesser-known lives of Hollywood's biggest and most enduring legends. In an upcoming video, we'll be exploring other classic Hollywood stars who own real-life ranches of their own, men and women whose lives off-screen turn out to be every bit as fascinating, and sometimes even more surprising, than anything they ever did in front of camera. Until then, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the very next one.